I'm incredibly grateful to Yesenia Rivera for joining us from Solar United Neighbors. And my first kind of conversation with Solar United Neighbors was, I think we might have some groups who are interested in actually moving forward with solar power. Is that something that you could partner with us on? And they were kind of, well, let's start the conversation. Let's figure out who's interested in and what states and what capacity we have. But it wasn't a no, it was a potentially yes, kind of depending on the interest. So I'm hoping that, this may result in longer term partnerships for those of you who are actually interested in bringing solar into your communities. And Yesenia has said that she's very happy for this to be as much a conversation as a presentation. And I know that all of you are very happy to ask lots of questions. So feel free to do that. Make this as much a conversation as a presentation. Feel free to ask your questions. So thank you so much, Yesenia, and I'll pass over to you.
Thank you, Harriet, and thank you all for inviting us and allowing us to talk about solar for the next hour and a half. As Harriet said, my name is Yesenia Rivera, and I am the Director of Energy Equity and Inclusion for Solar United Neighbors. Basically, my job is to work on increasing access to solar across the country. So I do this by developing pilots in different states on deploying low to moderate income solar, addressing the barriers to solar energy via policy or regulations, and just working with different coalitions to ensure that there is energy democracy and that folks have a say where their energy comes from and better control over how much they pay for that energy. So for those of you that don't know, SUN, Solar United Neighbors, we are a national nonprofit. We've been around for over 12 years now. We started in DC when our boss, her then son, asked her to do something because he had just seen an inconvenient truth and said, we need to do something about the environment. At that point, he was 13 years old, insisted that they had to go solar. This is 2007. Not a lot of folks were going solar around the district at that point. There was no such thing as a solar market in DC. So when Anya started looking around for information, she found out there wasn't a lot available and decided, if we're going to do this, we're going to bring the whole neighborhood with us. And the kids were tasked with signing up the neighbors to be part of this group purchasing effort. And in a matter of days, they had 50 neighbors sign up to be part of the process. And between them, they shared the duties on talking to installers, gathering information, educating each other on what it meant to go solar, talking to city officials to make the process go smoothly. And that's sort of how our co-op or bulk purchase model was born. That entire process took 2 years. Now we have it down to a science where it will take anywhere between 6 and 8 months, depending on the local permitting offices. But we are now in 12 different states with field staff on the ground, but we work on national issues. Actually, right now we're working on a federal campaign for 30 million solar homes and asking the federal government to invest in solar energy as a way to recover this economy, as a way to recover from COVID, and focus those funds and that recovery in under-resourced communities and environmental justice communities. So, like, we want to have everyone go solar, but do so in a way that's equitable, and it's helping folks recover from this economy. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about what solar energy is and how we can go solar, and then I'm going to talk how do we bring solar into our communities, what kind of programs we can develop. And like Harriet said, I'd rather this be a conversation, so please feel free to stop and ask me any questions, especially if I'm using terms. I'm used to these terms and talking about them on a daily basis, so if I say something that's not clear or I use an acronym, please stop me and I'll explain. So I will try not to use any acronyms, but if I go there, just stop me. So what is solar energy? It's actually pretty simple. There are two common ways most common ways for folks to go solar is by installing solar panels in their home or through community solar. And I'll explain that one in a minute. But solar panels on your home, it's easy as long as you have a decent roof that's not terribly shaded and it's structurally sound. The installer can come in, put the solar panels on your roof, and the sun hits those panels and it powers up your home. Like right now, I have a 7.5 kilowatt system on our roof. It is a nice sunny day here in the district area. So I am generating a lot of solar energy, which means that all of that energy is paying for my energy use at the moment. I am not taking anything from the grid. I'm actually pushing energy into the grid instead of using the energy from our utility provider, because the amount of energy I'm generating right now is way more than I need to run the house, even with me working from home. And that's sort of what happens. Like, you'll generate energy during the day, and if you're not using all of that energy, it goes straight into the grid, and you'll get a credit in most parts for that energy that you're sending to the grid. So let's say, for example, at the end of the month, I've generated over 1,000 kilowatt hours, but I've only used 600 kilowatt hours to power my home. I get a credit for the 1,000 hours that I generated. So they only charge me for whatever I use. And because I use less than what I generated, I don't get charged by the electric company. At least here in DC and Maryland, there's a minimum bill. The utilities like to charge a monthly minimum to cover the cost of maintaining the grid. For me, that is $8.35. So on a month where I am generating a lot of solar and not using a lot of energy, that's all I pay, is $8.35. Versus a typical bill, it can be in the hundreds of dollars a month. So there are benefits to going solar. There's economic benefits to going solar. And for a lot of folks, the barriers are, how do we pay for this? And we'll talk a little bit more in detail on that. Personally, we went with a leasing model. We don't own our panels, so we do pay the company that install the panels for the energy that we produce. So I pay at a lower rate than I would have paid the electric company. So even though I pay for that energy, I'm still paying half of what I would have paid the electric company. So I'm saving money at the end of the year, and I didn't have to put any money up front. That's called a power purchase agreement or a lease. Unfortunately, those are not allowed everywhere in the country. So those are one of the issues that we're fighting for, is to increase access to this type of financing, power purchasing or leasing agreements, so that especially moderate income folks or low income folks that may not necessarily have the money up front to install a solar system can still have access to solar energy, especially if they're homeowners and have a decent roof. When you have problems with your roof, whether you're a tenant, you live in a multifamily building, or your roof isn't structurally sound, you can still take advantage of solar energy using a program that we call community solar. And what does this mean? It means that we install the systems in churches, parking lots, buildings, farms, all across town. And folks that can install solar in their old buildings subscribe to these installations, and they share that solar amongst themselves. So you don't have to own the roof over your head. It doesn't have to be structurally sound for you still to benefit from community solar. You're still getting clean, renewable energy. You're getting a credit in your bill. Depends on how much of a subscription you're purchasing. The positive about that is that there's no upfront cost. Again, just like power purchase agreement, there is no upfront cost for folks to go via the community solar route or the PPA route. And it does save money. You're still paying. You're paying a little bit more than what you would pay if you actually own the system, but you're paying less than what you would have paid your utility for the same amount of energy. So you're still saving money. Obviously, if you own the panels outright, you'll save a lot more. But by just using solar energy, whether through power purchase agreements, leasing, or community solar, you're still saving a significant amount of money. And some community solar programs, especially those designed for low to moderate income homeowners, increase the savings just for those families. Like in Virginia, we have a shared solar program that guarantees at least 10% discount over what they would pay the utility. DC has an even more robust community solar program where low to moderate income folks save 50% off their monthly bills. So that's a saving, an annual saving about $600 a year that these families can set aside in case of an emergency and start rebuilding their lives financially. So it makes a difference. But any questions so far? No. Okay. So those are two ways to go solar. Those are the most common ways that folks go solar these days. But like power purchase agreements, community solar is not allowed everywhere. There are a lot of states, especially in the South and in the Midwest, that do not allow for community solar installations. Like the biggest objection comes from the utility companies. They have a hold on the system and they do not want to let go of that hold. So they argue on how costly it is to deploy this kind of solar and how they can do it better. And for a lot, what they do is we call it utility scale solar, where basically the utility company owns solar farms and charges folks for using that solar energy. It's not a great saving for the community. It actually costs more to get solar that way through utility scale. And it also doesn't help the community financially. When the community is involved in creating these community solar sites, when they have ownership and control over these community solar sites, you see a greater financial benefit for the community than when the utility company owns them. Like when it's the community involved, you're creating jobs, you're creating savings, and you're creating wealth for the community. So that's why it's really important that we fight for policies like community solar so that the community has control and can benefit from that creation of solar energy. Suzanne, I see your hand up.
I did, yeah. I'm wondering how much these things weigh and what the weight is for a typical roof. And what is the provision in the event of extreme weather? Like we get a lot of hurricanes here.
The weight is going to vary depending on the panel models and the system size. Typical panel size is about the size of a folding table. And they're about 15, 20 pounds each, or they could get a little heavy. In terms of structure and impact from extreme weather events, every city, every jurisdiction has a code that requires these systems to be able to withstand catastrophic weather events, hurricanes, storms. Like for example, here in DC, when you apply for a permit to install solar in your roof, that all goes through the Department of Consumer and Regulation Affairs, and they'll look at the system, they'll look at the design and make sure that it meets the minimum requirements for DC, in which case they should be able to withstand a Category 3 hurricane for DC. We don't see as many hurricanes in this part of the country, so that is like the highest, it's Category 3. But if you go to Puerto Rico and you want to install solar, there they have to be able to withstand almost a Category 5 hurricane because they're in the middle of Hurricane Alley. They've seen what these hurricanes can do. And because of those regulations and because of that benefit from the state and the city looking at what is being installed, a lot of these systems are set to be able to withstand those catastrophic and extreme weather events. So during Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, a lot of these systems were still strong enough to stand. Not a lot of systems were flown off the roofs, and that was a Category 4 hurricane because they're designed ahead of time to be able to withstand that pressure, to withstand those winds.
I think Rick had a question too, but thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate that. That's kind of you.
Rick, can you give me a second? Because I saw Francis' hand up first. I'll go with Francis and then I'll come back to you. That's okay.
Hi, my name is Frances Acuna. I'm a climate resilience community lead organizer in Austin, Texas. And about the solar panels, I know I had an interview with a representative from somebody selling panels, and I guess I had a lot of questions, and he was very persistent, and he was, it's a 30-year contract that you make with a company, and it's $60-something thousand that you have to pay over the course of 30 years. If you move out of your home, and the next owner doesn't want the panels, I had to remove them myself, which pay what, $2,000 to $4,000 for them to uninstall, and then go place them and pay something else, another amount in wherever I'm gonna move. So we're living in a place where gentrification and displacement is happening right now. And that is greatly affecting our communities. So for our communities, very low income families, having a loan for 30 years and then having to uninstall in, let's say, 4 or 5 years, whenever we're kicked out of our homes. I don't think it's a good thing.
Yes.
I know there's programs with the city where they give you, you have incentives of $3,500 that they can put as a down payment, I guess, I'm not sure. But if I look at the 3,000 and then the 4,000 that I'm gonna pay to uninstall them whenever I'm displaced from my community, and because it is happening, the displacement and gentrification is hitting so hard in the area that we live, because we live just about 10 minutes from downtown. So that is happening in our, in front of our eyes.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And it may not be an option for everyone, which is why when we design these programs, we have to pay attention to the community and the community needs. Because like you said, a lease agreement that locks them in for 30 years may not be the best option for that community. They may be better off with an ownership model where they actually own the system. So it adds value to their home. So that when they sell, they're not encumbered by a lease or a power purchase agreement. So they can go ahead and sell the house at a larger value because they install solar. But for us, it's all about education and making sure the consumer understands all of the options and letting them make an informed decision. And what I've seen, especially working in the district area, there's a lot of installers out there, unfortunately, that will do anything for a sale. They would say anything and they will promise anything, but they don't really explain what folks are getting into. And the devil's in the details. When you look at those contracts, especially if you're thinking about a power purchase agreement or leasing agreement, there may be an escalator clause where, yes, the initial rate is lower than your utility company's rate, but throughout the years, that rate is going to increase to a point where you actually may pay more than what you're paying the utility company. So it's very important to go over the details to understand exactly what it is you're signing. It may be something that works for you. It may not be something that works for the community. So when we're designing these type of solar programs, that's the kind of questions we have to keep in mind. It's like, what are the dynamics of the community? What will actually benefit the community? When we design our program here in DC, we were part of the Solar for All program. And we got a grant from the district for almost $2 million to develop a low to moderate income solar program. Everybody else had to sign their programs based on leasing and power purchase agreements that, even though they weren't costing the families at the end of the day, if that family was displaced, if that family had to sell for whatever reason, it was going to be difficult. There weren't going to be any charges attached to it because it wasn't, the city was covering most of the lease. So they wouldn't have to pay to remove it or anything like that. But it was still going to make it very complicated for them to sell their home. So with that in mind, we designed a program based on ownership. We wanted the families to own their system. We wanted the families to receive the same benefit that everybody else paying for their solar systems received. In a market like DC, there's so many incentives for going solar, where just you generate income just by going solar. The typical system can generate up to like $4,000 to $5,000 a year in income by going solar, because of the way our portfolio standards are designed, where the utility company wants to buy that solar energy, those credits from you, to show the city that they're meeting the requirements of producing X amount of solar energy. So that's a benefit. But when you're talking about a lease or a power purchase agreement, those families do not get that benefit. That benefit goes to the owner of the system. So we designed a program where the families actually own their system, where they receive the benefits from owning the solar system. And if they had to sell their home, there wasn't an encumbrance. There wasn't extra paperwork for them to sell their home and ask for permission because there's solar system on their roof that's leased. And actually, we had 1 or 2 families that did end up selling shortly after going solar. And it was just a matter of saying, hey, I sold my home, here's the new owner. Goodbye. That was it. But they were able to, because they went solar and because they owned that system, it actually increased the value of their home, and they were able to keep that value, keep that equity. So again, it's all about the community needs and keeping those in at the top when you're designing these programs, because otherwise you're going to do more harm than good. Rick?
Yes, okay, she had a great question there. You answered it terrific, because that is a big deal. Okay, you see a lot of these solar panels around here. This is not the question I'm asking, but you see a lot of solar panels around here, and they are leased in that effect. So the owner's not getting the full benefit, and it must stay on the property, and the new buyer has to get it. So I know years ago, the state of New Jersey did have grant money. Okay, so I'm kind of leaning to the community thing in that sense of it. But however, in order to get some of this grant money, you had to have a certain roof alignment, number of sun. I know we got disqualified because at 3 o'clock the neighbor's porch was shading on our house, so we couldn't get that. So that's when I think all these lease programs came up, and unfortunately that's what we run into. And for all the money they're putting on the wind turbines, they probably could put these grants back in place. But that's another topic. What about, until recently, we were considering the shingles until last week. And have you any thoughts on how more efficient they may be, the pros, the cons of them, other than what he's trying to get out of people for installing them?
Good question. Virtually, there's just not a lot of public information out there on how efficient these systems are. What we do know is they cost way more than a traditional solar system right now, to the point where for a lot of folks, it's just prohibitive, the cost. And that's sort of what happens when you have new technology come into the market. It costs a lot more to develop and deploy that new technology. After a couple of years, when you're able to mass produce, the cost drops significantly, which is what we've seen with solar panels themselves. But what we know right now is that it is a costly endeavor. Whether or not they're more efficient than panels, we don't know yet. Like I said, they're holding their cards close to their chest.
Yeah, I'm hoping the state,
like everything Tesla does.
that the state does come back with more of these programs.
And that's one of the things we advocate for, is how do we make sure that everyone that wants to go solar has the means and the access to be able to go solar? I mean, you look at the incentives at the federal level, there's a 26% tax credit. And that's nice if you have a tax liability and you can put the money up front, because you have to pay for the system up front. The problem is that we don't all have that fund. We don't all have that fund. We don't have $20,000 sitting aside in our bank account to be able to go solar and then wait for the federal government to rebate us or credit us for that 26%. So a lot of these policies, especially when we're talking about rebates, again, the state will have a $3,000, a $5,000 rebate, but still you have to pay upfront for that cost and wait for the bureaucracy to go through all the paperwork
Right.
and send you the rebate 3-6 months down the line. And that's not an option that everybody has. So what we're advocating is, one, make that tax refund, make it a refundable tax credit,
Yes.
where even if you do not have a tax liability,
Mhm.
you can still take advantage of that refund. If you're a nonprofit, if you're a low-income homeowner that does not owe taxes, you can still benefit. Like if we're talking like earned income tax credit, where it's a refundable credit, not depending on whether or not you owe any taxes. Better yet, let's figure out a way to make this a point of sales rebate so that you don't have to pay upfront.
Well,
for
you
that
know, you would
cost.
think it would make sense, particularly in communities where they need this, because they're forever in the winter hearing about, people don't have their electric on, they don't have the money to pay the bill, they're going to shut it off. I think their money is better spent in something that you're doing, the community thing, where these people do not have to face these large bills, and they can devote their money to other needs that they have in their life. Yeah.
Hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did.
Okay,
Thank you.
Lisa, no, you're welcome. Lisa, I see your hands up.
I'm Lisa Martin. I live in Florida, and I am wondering how you deal with the wide variety of regulations and agreements. For example, where I live, there is a community utility commission. And they are a wholesaler of electricity. They buy electricity and they buy an increasing amount of it to be solar. Last time I checked, there was no agreement for residential, but they had some strange thing for commercial. And I'm thinking, I live in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, one of the smaller areas in the whole country or world. And I'm different from where, I don't know, Daytona Beach, which is just down the road. How do you cope with all that?
A lot of research and education. We actually have about almost 4 staffers on the ground in Florida because of that. Because every region, every jurisdiction is different. It has its own rules and it has its own sets of challenges and problems associated with helping folks go solar. And you really do have to pay attention to the locality rules, to the regulations, and be able to explain that to folks. So if you look at our info sessions where we educate folks about going solar, you'd see that every state has its own set of slides because there are different things involved. There are different players involved. Some may have utility programs, some may have a local rebate. So there's a lot of nuance involved in these processes, and that's why it's good to go out and talk to a neutral third party when they would give you, like, we have no skin in the game. If you go solar, if you don't go solar, that's fine. We just want to make sure you have the information. And there's some other groups out there that walk you through what does this all mean and how does it affect you and how does it benefit you.
Yeah, I guess if you came into my community, I think you would be stopped by our utilities commission because there is no prescribed interaction with the New Smyrna Beach Utilities Commission. There's no regulations, there's no anything. So it's sort of like you're stopped at our borders.
Yeah, those are some of the problems we encounter, especially when we're dealing with municipalities or rural electric co-ops, and just utilities in general. They don't tend to like solar programs. They tend to make it difficult for folks to go solar because throughout this entire process, not only do you have to get permission from the city and from your local authorities to be able to go solar, you still need permission from the utility company to connect to their grid. So part of what we do is identify those barriers and educate folks and educate lawmakers on this is what's keeping folks from going solar. Because it's a matter of choice. It's a matter of empowering folks to have a choice, to have a say in where their energy comes from. Because when you control where your energy comes from, you control how much you pay for it. I saw 2 hands up, Joe first, and then Ms.
Suzanne
Gordon.
and Gordon.
Hi, Yesenia. I'm Joe Tyrone in Staten Island, New York, Oakwood Beach buyout. I'm not here as a buyout thing. It's more as a homeowner and community activist. So interested in solar panels. So a couple of questions. One is I do notice them going up now and then. It doesn't seem to me like the technology is changing that much because every time I see one go up, it's these massive solar panels that cover the entire roof. So I've been waiting for like 5 years to see the technology, in front of me change, where I see something off the roof or smaller panels, or maybe you discussed before where they have the shingles, whatever. So I'm just wondering where the technology is right now. And then the other thing I'm wondering is there a site that you could refer us to that we could find incentives? I know there have been incentives here in New York, the New York City RISE program. I actually have another building that was significantly damaged in Sandy, but it wasn't appropriate for a buyout. It's a brick building. And I did get the opportunity to get a free solar system. However, here in New York, the fire department rules and they nixed it because they just said it wasn't safe. So we're doing a generator instead, but that's gone. That's no longer in existence. So is there a site, or do you just Google solar panels, New York City, federal government, and just see what you come up with?
Yeah, there are actually several programs coming down the pipeline in New York. I think the state in general is very committed, especially to assisting low to moderate income homeowners access renewable clean energy. So I will check with my New York coalition members and get the information to Harriet so she can get it to you.
Mhm.
In terms of that technology, I think a lot of the focus right now is in making those panels more efficient so that you can get a larger system size with a lower amount of panels. That's sort of where the bulk of the research is, but there are a lot of other research. There's the shingles, there's even solar windows, research into solar windows. Like you said, people are trying to get creative. There is still a challenge of developing these technologies and making sure they work and deploying them. But I would say that right now, I think the focus in general is we know these solar panels work. We know that PV works. Let's try to make them as efficient as possible so that you need a lower amount of panels on your roof. You don't have to cover the whole roof to get the big benefit.
Okay, thank you.
So you're welcome. And
Suzanne and then Gordon. No, not Suzanne?
No.
No, Gordon then.
I had to unmute, thank you. And please excuse, we're under a heavy thunderstorm. Sometimes you might hear thunder. The question I had is in regard to infrastructure, whether it's within a state or within a city. I'm in Biloxi, Mississippi. I chair the NACP Mississippi State Environmental Climate Justice Committee and for Biloxi. Our situation is that we've got people interested in implementing both individual solar and community solar, but what has gotten in our way is a very weak net metering policy. And about the past month or two, about 30 of our organizations, environmental organizations here, have come together and formally sent recommendations and improvement ideas to our Public Service Commission. And we're still in progress with that. So based on that, could you just give me an idea as what makes a very solid and healthy infrastructure, whether it be in the state or the city or county, that would make solar programs very successful?
Yes, good, very good question. I actually work with the NAACP's, ECJ, committees a lot, part of the Solar Equity Initiative. So I work with Jane and
Jackie
Denise.
Patterson.
Yep.
Yep,
Jane,
yep.
Denise, and
Yeah,
Jackie
we
a
work with them
lot.
very closely.
Yes. So in terms of policies, net metering is a big one. It is a challenge. Without net metering, getting the credit for the energy you're producing, and most of the time overproducing, and sending back to the grid is impossible. And like you said, there's way too many states that do not allow for net metering, unfortunately, or have a very watered down version of net metering. And even in some places, we had Indiana, who until just a couple of years ago actually had a very robust net metering policy in place where you get one-to-one credit. So if you produce 1,000 kilowatt hours, you get a credit for 1,000 kilowatt hours on your bill. So if you're producing, great, you're not paying the utility company. Well, the utility companies have been spending a lot of resources convincing public service and public utility commissions across the country that net metering is a bad thing and that they have to do away with it. Unfortunately, the legislators in Indianapolis did just that and killed net metering. So if you had already gone solar, you were grandfathered in. Anybody that wanted to go solar afterwards was out of luck. And that entirely changes the financial dynamics of a project. Because if you're not getting that credit for the energy you're producing, it makes it really hard to get that return on investment. So what we're doing, and a lot of other folks across the country are doing, is arguing for strong net metering policies and trying to find a way for the federal government to make sure that everyone has access to net metering policies, which is kind of tricky because FERC does not like to step in those levels. They see it as a locality matter, and they want to stay as far away from it as possible. But at the same time, I know there's a lot of groups working across the country on advocating for these types of policies so that we can make it easier for folks to go solar if they want to go solar. The other big policy is that community solar. Like, not a lot of jurisdictions allow for these community solar projects, and they don't have what we call virtual net metering, where yes, you build a community solar, you subscribe to it. How is that credited on your account? They don't allow for that type of credit on your account. So those are some of the barriers that we've seen, and some of the things we're trying to address via policy, whether it's federal policy and having the federal government step in with community solar bills or net metering bills, or local activists and local policymakers talk them into why this is needed.
If I could provide a follow-up question with that, what you just said, with the finally a turnaround and the emphasis of climate change with the new presidential administration, are there anybody approaching the environmental committees within the administration and recommending something like a strong national net metering initiative or something along those lines?
Oh, yes. There are a lot of groups involved right now. I think, especially we see that what happened in January with Congress switching hands, with the administration now focusing on environmental justice and having a commitment to environmental justice. A lot of us see this as a once in a lifetime opportunity to get these measures passed, get these policies in place. And we also see that the administration has actually named many activists to be part of the Department of Energy. They created an energy equity office at the Department of Energy. This is a first. So there's a lot of groups out there that are having these conversations with administration officials at the federal level, but also with Congress. Just about a month ago, the Energy Democracy Project, which is a national coalition of energy democracy frontline communities across the country, we actually held a congressional briefing to help educate Congress on what energy democracy is and how we can achieve energy equity and what kind of policies they should be thinking about when they're developing these bills and looking at infrastructure programs or where to invest the federal money.
And would it behoove us to try to find a way strategy to address the state legislator within our own states?
Oh, most definitely. This is a two-prong approach. You go to the federal government and you push them as much as you can to deploy that money to invest in the states, but you need the states to be interested in these programs, because at the end of the day, they control how that money is spent. And a lot of these rules are local, are state rules that need to be addressed. So you need to address both sides.
Thank you very much.
So I have a question. So say, and I'm just kind of looking at people in particular, those who represent, equity communities, low income, historically marginalized communities. So say Francis in Austin and Michelle in Port Arthur, so both Texas, Rebecca's group in Miami, Oklahoma, Dee Dee in New Orleans, Gordon in Biloxi, Mississippi. They go, amazing presentation, Harriet, that you just had. Thank you so much. Yesenia did a fantastic job. We really want to start working on this and get solar into our communities. How might you respond? I don't want to put you on the hook, but I suppose you get a sense of, and I know it varies from state to state, which I guess is part of the answer. And June in Marin City, in California, what would be the next steps for such a thing? Should you, be able to help them?
Yeah, I would say the next step is deciding what type of program are you willing to deploy. It's like, how do we bring solar? And that can look there. I mean, there's so many different ways to address that question. You can talk about rooftop solar and helping individual homeowners go solar. We could be talking about deploying community solar projects and making sure that low to moderate income homeowners and tenants have access to solar energy and get that credit on their bill. We could talk about resiliency centers and creating these resiliency hubs to help folks weather storms and other environmental disasters, so that it doesn't hit them as hard, because there's at least one oasis in the community where they can go and cool down or heat up and take care and put away their medications that need to be refrigerated and charge their phones so they can tell their loved ones they're still okay. Or you can even invest in other nonprofits and help them go solar. So you reduce their operating costs, which means there's more funding to help the community members. So it's deciding which of those routes are we going to take. As I said, they each have their benefits. They each have their challenges. It's a matter of like looking at the community, looking at the needs of the community, the dynamics of the community, and seeing what is the best way to address that. And that particular aspect, I think, involves a lot of conversations with the community itself. I've seen a lot of these projects, especially when they're coming from local governments or state governments, be developed in a vacuum and be developed without any sort of community input whatsoever. And then they go to the communities like, look at this great thing we developed, here, take it or leave it. The friction, the mistrust that creates, because you didn't bother actually sitting down with the community and asking them what they needed and what they would like to see. It's just, it really creates for a much harder deployment, even if you're creating a benefit. The fact that you started by just ignoring the community and not asking them what they wanted makes it a lot harder to deploy these types of programs. So I would say, sit down with the community. And I mean, most of you are frontline organizations or frontline activists, so you already have a pretty good sense of what the community wants and what the community would like to see. But have those conversations, and then let's sit down and see, okay, so these are the needs. This is what the community wants to see. Which of these routes is the best way to address that? And if it's rooftop solar, if it's community solar or resiliency hubs, we may be able to help you. If the community's needs and wants are somewhere else, we may be able to refer you somebody that can help you. So it's about having those conversations with the community and deciding what's the best way to address that. And I have a really nice example of just this type of conversation. DC is in the process of creating a zero emissions gas plan. The goal is to have zero gas emissions by 2032. That's the goal. And most of the time when the city is developing this kind of plan, it's just the policy wonks in a room writing down what the plan is. And then after everything's all said and done, they'll come to a community and say, hey, this is what we're doing. This time, I think the city listened to us and learned from previous mistakes and actually sat down with community members and said, this is what we want to achieve. It's zero gas emissions. This is how it affects you. And, you know, we spent an entire summer talking about the link between gas emissions and health and jobs and transportation and housing with community members and asking them, how does this plan affect you? What do you want to see in order for the city to implement a plan? And just having these conversations between city officials and community members. And at the end of those conversations, then the government put together a plan based on what they heard from the community, instead of creating a plan and then going out to the community trying to sell it.
So that
So it can be done.
The people had comments, June has a comment, so I just make one. So that kind of makes me look again at Joe Tyrone. They had the amazing buyouts of properties, and what I learned from Joe was articulate what it is you want and then advocate for it. And I guess that's kind of what you're saying. Obviously, people will learn a little bit more about what it is they want when they know what the options are. But
yeah, I mean, it's sometimes you have to go, it's like, okay, there's a whole set of options that all different routes that we can take, or sort of like explain what they look like, but it really is up to the community on whether or not this is what they want to do and if it meets the needs that the community has expressed. But sometimes they like, okay, let me explain what the options are, and you tell me whether or not this fits and whether or not this is what you want to do.
Right, wonderful. June, I think, did you have your hand up, June?
Yes. So recently I attended 2 meetings here in Marin City. There was funding for someone to work with we have the Marin Clean Energy organization, and another organization with solar, and they want to put they're going to put a resiliency hub here in Marin City. And so they came to the community to find out the location which would best suit the community. However, the way that Marin City is laid out is that you have like public housing on one side, and then on the other side you have homeowners, and then you go into like some co-op apartments, and it's actually shaped like this. So I'm like really like laying it out. So you got the homeowners, and then you got the co-ops, and then you'll have some apartments. And then you go up the hill and there's some more apartments and townhouses. And so all this down here, and then you got some more apartments in the middle. All this down here is actually like older Marin City people, or it's kind of blended in some areas. So you have a lot of the homeowners that are elderly. You have a lot of the people in the public housing that are elderly or disabled and can't get out. And then you have the upper people that want to call themselves Sausalito instead of Marin City. And so when we were in the discussion about where to put the resiliency hub, the location we chose was the school. But then we were also concerned and asking questions about how can we bring solar into Marin City that would be effective for everyone. And so that's a great discussion. But right now, they're only focusing on the resilience hub. and not the rest of the city. And so that was one of the questions that I have was, how can we get solar into everybody in Marin City? I forgot the numbers of people that actually live in public housing, whether it's 800 and something, or is it 800 and something apartments? I don't have that number handy, but it's just, you struggle.
Yeah.
You struggle trying to pay PG&E and things, and
Yeah.
like our
And,
lights are always on.
and that's the biggest problem is the energy burden. It falls mostly on low income families. I mean, the
Right.
national average is 8.6% of their income. It can be as high as 30% income. And when you're spending 30% of your income just on paying your utility bills, that doesn't leave a lot of money for everything else. So like we really need to address that energy burden and that energy inequality. And resiliency centers are great in case of emergencies, but they don't really address the energy burden and the energy inequality, because the resiliency centers, like you said, it's a school, it may be a church, it may be a rec center, and it's there in case the power goes out. You still have that place, which is needed, especially when you're dealing with a community that has a lot of seniors, a lot of elderly folks that do not have that mobility, do not have the option of going somewhere else and weathering the storm. And the problem is that they also don't have the option to pay for solar systems because they're living on a fixed income. And it's extremely hard at that point to be able to pay for these systems or even take out a loan to pay for these systems, because at that point it may not make any sense at all. So how do we get those resiliency centers? And I think the thing is, like, how do we make that just the first step, not the last step, not everything when it comes to solar, but that has to be a first step. How do we convince the city that it's worth investing in solar programs across the city and making sure that everyone has access to clean energy and we reduce those burdens? And that's where there are some funding opportunities. There's federal funding. Some states have funding mechanisms, whether it's taxes or fees, that they can set aside to cover the cost of systems. And in some cases, we've seen private investment in either philanthropy or working with financial institutions to develop mechanisms, to develop grants to help these families go solar. It is a much heavier lift, especially if we're talking about individual homeowners. Financing those systems gets harder. Convincing folks to give you the money to create these programs is a lot harder when we're talking about individual systems. But when it comes to public housing, I think there's a place there, especially for the federal government, to cover the costs of these systems and to create a basically what would be a community solar size, because we're talking about a very large system that's going to help everyone in that building go solar. And at the end of the day, the more folks we help go solar, the better it is for everyone, because there's less demand on the grid. And when we have less demand on the grid, means we turn on peaker plants less. And that is a benefit for everyone, because every time we turn on a peaker plant, everyone pays more for their energy bills. And not only do you pay more for your energy bills, you're putting a lot more contamination out into the environment every time we have to turn on one of these peaker plants. So helping folks go solar, whether it's with resiliency centers or creating community solar sites or individual solar homeowners, that helps everyone, because we're reducing the demand on the grid. We're making it easier for utility companies not to turn on these peaker plants. So we save everyone money and we save our environment while we're doing it. So it is a challenge, but I guess that you can say that of everything. A lot of the times we just have to get creative with the funding, and convince folks that it's worth the investment. And you're gonna have to knock on a lot of doors, but have a plan and just keep going.
Dee Dee. Don't forget to say who you are, where you're from.
Hello, everybody. Yesenia, I'm Dee Dee Green. I live in New Orleans. I'm on the board of Holly Grove Neighbors Association, and by way of Holly Grove Neighbors Association, I sit on a climate action equity advisory group, and it is the Greater New Orleans Foundation, some experts in energy, waste, transportation, and workforce development. And the city is involved, City of New Orleans, and Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And so we have secured some funding to pilot a community solar project, but the idea is the program would support low-income working families, support them in purchasing the solar. And I was just wondering, I apologize because I came on late and I have to leave early for another meeting, but I was wondering, you may have already discussed this. Do you have examples of programs that operate like that? And I also, that are providing, programs that are providing the capital or whatever for low-income families to buy into a solar program. And I just wanted to kind of co-sign what you said about community engagement is critical, because we were, the little subcommittee that I sit on, we're responsible for the engagement piece, but folks on that particular subcommittee were like, well, let's just identify the property and begin the process. I was like, there's no way you can do that without talking to the folks in the community. And the board that I sit on, the neighborhood Holly Grove that I represent, we have examples of green infrastructure that gets installed and then nobody's responsible for it. So now it's not functioning as it was intended. It's falling apart. And folks in the neighborhood are like, what is Sewage and Water Board gonna do about that? What is becoming a bit of an albatross? Like, what are they gonna do about that? You come in, you have these great ideas, you build this water catchment system, and years later, it's just there. So I just wanna just kind of co-sign what you said about community engagement being really key as these programs are, being created in neighborhoods. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, in terms of examples, I guess the model and the best example across the nation is what we have here in DC, which is called the Solar for All program. And the way this program came about, it took about 10, 12 years of advocacy and just going back to city council to help create a solar market in what we call renewable portfolio standard. And what that means is the city has a commitment to clean energy. And throughout their years, we've seen that commitment increase to a point where in 2015, it was set to 50% clean energy. So at least 50% of the district's energy had to come from clean renewable sources by 2032. That was the goal. And 5% of that energy had to come from solar. And the reason we focused on solar and we insisted that 5% came specifically from solar is because we know that by focusing on solar energy, we are creating wealth and benefits for the community that stay inside the community. Like DC has no place for wind turbines, has no place for hydro plants. So when you're talking about hydro, when you're talking about winds, that's money that goes outside the district. That is money and jobs that are created outside of the district. But when we're talking about solar energy, we're talking about jobs and money that's invested inside DC. So because they have this 5% solar carve out meant that the utility companies had to pay a fine every time they fall short of that goal. So they pay about $500 per megawatt every time they fall short. And in a year, the city can collect between $15 to $40 million in fines. from the utility companies. And what we talked the city into doing is setting those funds aside specifically for low to moderate income solar programs. So the city created the Solar for All program, and the goal is to help 100,000 low to moderate income families and seniors go solar at no cost to them and save them 50% off their utility bills. So this looks, there's many ways that the city's doing this. A lot of it is through community solar, because we have a lot of residents living in multifamily buildings. We have a lot of tenants that may not own their roofs or that don't have a roof good enough to go solar. So I would say that 90% of the funds are using to create community solar facilities where folks get a 50% discount on their energy bill. So, and that is one of the biggest offsets across the country. I think the biggest offset in the country. It's 50% off their electric bill every month. And for homeowners, if their roof is good enough, they get a free solar system on their roof that cuts down their bill in half. Again, and we're doing this at no cost to the families. At no point are they paying upfront for the systems. Now, when we design our program, I mentioned it earlier, we focus on ownership. We did it different than everybody else. Everybody else was doing leasing or power purchase agreements, which they're okay, but they're not exactly equitable when we're talking about deploying solar energy, and they can make it harder if folks have to sell their house. Because it happens, especially when we're dealing, like Francis brought up, like displacement and gentrification. And sometimes you just have to sell because you're pushed out of that market. So, and if you have a lease, there's so many strings attached and so many hoops you have to jump through just to sell your house that we didn't think it was fair or equitable to do so. So we created a program that made sure the families own their system from day one. So if they had to sell their house, they actually gain value by owning their by owning that solar system. And there was no hoops to jump through in order to sell the house. It's their house. They can sell it whenever they want and to whoever they want. They just had to write an email, say, hey, I sold the house. Here's the new owner. Bye. And that was it. So again, it comes to what are the community needs and what would benefit the community. And there's different ways of doing this. DC did it by finding the polluters. In other cities, we've seen, for example, the city of Houston really wants to deploy low-income solar, but they have their hands tied because they can't increase taxes per state regulations. So what they're doing is they're talking to foundations and donors and trying to fundraise the money so they can deploy low-income solar, because unfortunately they can't increase taxes, they can impose fees because the state says they're not allowed to do that. So the city decided that we're going to fundraise for this. We're going to hit donors and focus on philanthropy and organizations out there that are willing to pay for this. And that's what they're doing right now. In Indiana, we work with the city of Indianapolis. The city's sustainability office was really focused on their sustainability goals and making sure the city transitioned to clean energy, but they didn't want to leave anyone behind. They wanted it to be a just transition. They wanted to develop low-income solar programs. So we're working with them. They have some federal funds that they're asking for permission to switch from just energy efficiency to energy efficiency in solar, so that we can help families not only put a solar system on their roofs, reduce their bill, but also deploy energy efficiency measures so they save even more. So there's a lot of different ways to cover for these programs. It really does depend on the city and the jurisdiction and their will to get creative and knock on doors.
Suzanne had a couple of other questions.
Yes. Hey, Suzanne.
I did. I put them in the chat because I didn't want to mess up the conversation. But I wondered what is the efficiency of solar compared to other forms of energy? Also, what is the disposal like when they've lived their life? What happens then? And I guess my third question is, does your group come into individual communities to try to help set up programs? Or do you have to be a low-income community? Because our community is kind of both.
We work with any income levels. We actually have a very robust market rate program. That's how we started. It's helping moderate higher income folks develop these bulk purchase campaign, making it easier and cheaper for them to go solar. We do that, but now we're focused also on low or moderate income communities and trying to work with them to find the finances to create these programs to help everyone go solar, so we're not leaving anyone behind. As for the recycling, I guess most of these panels that were deployed in the 70s are still, they're still installed, they're still working. They're reaching the end of their useful life. So now is like, it's just now that the industry is starting to have these conversations in terms of recycling and how do we dispose of these panels after they've been used. And yeah, folks are coming up with some really creative ideas on how to address this problem. I've seen groups that will come in after a disaster and maybe the panel was damaged or like lightly damaged. They'll refurbish those panels and use them to create resiliency hubs. You know, I've seen folks where, you know what, my panels are not that old, but they're not the nicest, they're not the latest example in the market. I want higher efficiency panels, and they're taking off those panels to install higher efficiency panels, and we're using those to help folks that couldn't afford to go solar and deploying them in schools, nonprofits, and other helping other families benefit from what was helping, was still very useful, but no longer what you wanted. So, and unfortunately, there's still a great number of them that do end up in junkyards. And I think as an industry, we need to do more to address that and know that there are folks that are looking at that and trying to make sure that we recycle every little bit of these panels and just, you know, just lower the amount of energy it takes to create them, lower the amount of pollution that it takes to create them by just recycling as much as we can.
Can you speak to the efficiency of them compared to other forms of electric generation?
Yeah, we know that it is cheaper to focus on clean energy, whether it's solar, wind, or hydro, than it is to focus on fossil fuels. And we know that they are just as efficient as any other form. It's like, I know one of the things I keep hearing, especially when talking to Congress, is like, well, the sun doesn't shine at night, or, you know, hydro doesn't work all day long, or the wind's not always there. But, you know, when you couple these with storage options, you can run a house on just solar and storage all day long and not have to depend on the grid. So there are options where you can work with both, you know, or you can run the house during the day on solar and in the evenings focus on hydro and wind. There's a lot of combinations that make this just as efficient. And I know that recently everybody keeps pointing at Texas and trying to blame the wind turbines and the clean energy for what happened in Texas during this last freeze. But the reality is that the Texas market focused on just that, on the market rate, and didn't care about weatherization, did not care about preparing themselves ahead of time for these winter storms, even though they had been warned that if we have a deep freeze, and we will have one, these systems are going to fail. You know, and they didn't take the necessary precautions to make sure that those wind turbines kept working even in case of a freeze, because they can work. You know, we've seen that in Nova Scotia, we've seen that in Canada, which is way colder than what Texas got this summer. They still work, but Texas didn't take the steps necessary to make sure those systems keep working in the case of, you know, an energy disaster or a climate, national climate disaster. So yeah, they can be efficient as fossil fuels, even more. They said it's cheaper to focus on clean energy and to pay for clean energy than it is to pay for fossil fuels.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, because we already know from our research here that it's not cheaper to have wind. And the windmills here, the wind turbines, that they want to put up will begin their life at 56% efficiency. And by the time that electricity goes to the substation, then across our island and over to the energy plant, and then from there up to northern New Jersey, and from there to New York, where they don't want the wind turbines, so they're going to buy from Jersey, it's going to be 23% of what was originally generated at 5 to 7 times more cost. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the solar panels, because the wind also doesn't store energy. If they're not turning, they're not generating, period. But solar does have the ability to store.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how that changes the efficiency. What I've read is that solar panels are a little bit higher in efficiency, like 65, 70%, but I'm wondering if you have more accurate numbers.
Yeah, that seems to be like the standard right now in the industry, is around 60 to 65%. Unfortunately, there's nothing out there that's 100% efficient. But at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, the industry is working on making these panels more efficient by the day. It's like they really are focusing on increasing that efficiency, on increasing the amount of energy you can pack in these panels, to make sure you use less of those. But at the same time, like you said, the beauty about solar is that you can power it, you can combine it with storage, and you can run the house all day, whether or not the sun is shining. We are working on a pilot out in Puerto Rico where we're helping folks install solar and batteries. And this is a moderate and middle income class community. And surprisingly enough, every single one of them signed a contract for both solar and storage because, they saw what happened in Hurricane Maria. They were without power for 3 to 4 months at a time. They don't ever want to go through that again. And if they had their way, they would be completely off the grid. Unfortunately, the regulations do not allow for that down on the island. So what they're doing is they're installing solar and they're installing batteries to make sure that the next time the grid fails, because they know it's going to fail, that they are covered, that they're protected, and they can still power their house. Rick?
Okay, I'm sorry. The first I'm going to introduce myself. I'm also Ocean City Flooding. Okay, I do have clients that have solar panels and combined with geothermal, and it's unbelievable how much of nothing they pay for their electricity between the two of them. So it's a great combination.
It really is. Like, there's so many ways to power it, and we don't work a lot with geothermal. We focus on PV, on photovoltaics. But yeah, it is a great way to power the house and not pay anything to the grid. Like I said, on a good month, I pay $1.50 to the utility company because I'm getting all my energy from the sun.
Well, we only have to pay $1.49, right, Suzanne? More.
Yeah, that's another of those things that it varies by jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Like in DC, the minimum is $15.
Yeah, he's teasing you. We're going to be paying a whole lot more than that.
Yeah,
that's for the windmills. They're saying it's only going to be $1.49 more in our bills.
Yeah, you should see
what. Know that's not true.
You should see what the utility company proposed in Virginia when we finally got them to pass a real Community Solar Act. There was a little caveat in there that the legislators introduced saying that the utility company got to decide what the minimum bill would be.
Yeah.
They came back with a minimum bill of $70.
Oh.
Yeah.
You know what's fascinating about that is that twice I've contacted both the BPU and the company Leviton to ask them how they came up with this, because they start out with a certain kilowatt or megawatts, and then they get credits and they get a discount and so forth, and assumed credits that they'll be selling out there because there's no guarantee of that. But I never got an answer, and it just happened that the state's going to start a study of the real cost. It'll take 18 months, which is past the governor's period that he's going to be up for re-election in November. So sometimes these things just don't know, and we're trying to get to the bottom of that. But that's another topic, and we'll leave that alone, Harriet, right?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in New Jersey, and actually we're part of a coalition that's pushing for clean energy particularly solar clean energy in New Jersey, and I'm actually going to put that into the chat box. They're pushing for low to moderate income solar, helping folks deploy community solar and rooftop solar in New Jersey and create jobs.
Thank you for that.
Find some more.
That's terrific. We support that here.
Harriet, you're on mute. You're talking.
Yeah, we're close to the end. Maybe could I ask you just as a final? Hi, Laurie. Sorry, we're just finishing, but lovely to see you. Do you have any stories, particularly of smaller communities, where one person went, we're going to go solar, and the whole community, and particularly lower income, would be particularly inspiring? Something to leave us with, that to make us feel inspired, that Miami and Austin and Chicago and Ocean City could be the next.
Yeah, it's funny how we've seen solar spread like wildfire. Like once you have one neighbor go solar, it sort of like increases the interest everybody around them. For example, I live in a predominantly Black neighborhood right outside of the district in Prince George's County. When we first moved in, no one around us had solar panels, but we knew right away that we wanted to go solar after we bought the house, so we did that. Now we walk around our neighborhood and there's at least 10 to 15 homes that have gone solar since, and every day we see another solar system go up. It's like people don't really think about it until they see somebody else that's done it, or they know a friend or a family member that has done it. So that word of mouth is key to deploying solar and solar adoption. And we see that when there are studies out there. I think Nature Energy published a study a few years ago on solar adoption in Black and Brown communities, in communities of color, where even when you account for income levels and home ownership, they're still lagging behind solar adoption in white communities. But when you actually make an effort to seed these solar projects, to talk about solar, they adopt at a much faster pace than white communities. So there's this interest in it, but until you actually see it happen, it's not even crossing your mind. When we worked with the Solar for All program, the low income program, we saw this very funny thing is we had these clusters of neighborhoods where one neighbor went solar with the program, and once those panels were up, I was getting calls from all of their other neighbors saying, hey, I want to qualify for this program. What do I need to do? So we ended up having like clusters of 5 or 6 homes that went solar together through the program because one of them had their panels up and everybody else is like, oh, wait, this is actually real. I can do this. Let me go ahead and read more and find out some more. So I think once you have those first adopters, especially if they like talking about it, it's a lot easier to convince folks.
Good. So everyone on this call, you are the first homeowners. We need to help you get your solar panels onto your homes and plant the seed. Well, so
I'm actually talking to the city about that. I want to get it. We have new senior housing, and I've been actually talking to the city about bringing that. We have low income housing and senior housing, brand new complexes that are currently being built, that I've been bugging the city about. We need to go solar.
good.
Ignore my chihuahua.
Excellent. And so I'm happy to act as a go-between if any of you want me to reach out on your behalf so that Yesenia doesn't, receive lots of emails. I'm happy to act as a go-between if you do want to actually see if we can take this further and develop some kind of partnership between your community and Solar United Neighbors.
I would love that.
Wonderful. Okay, I'll send an email out and then I'll sort of log those who are interested, and maybe I'll set up a call and we can discuss further.
Happy to help.
Thank you, everyone, as ever.
Thank you, guys.
Sorry, everybody.
Really appreciate it. Lovely to see you all. Bye.